Welcome aboard the Artist Life, a floating art studio for her owner and a lifesaver for countless fishermen and sailors around the Gulf of Georgia. Good evening. Welcome to Red's Classic Theater. This week from Steveston, aboard the Artist Life, a Coast Guard auxiliary ship owned by marine artist John Horton. And we'll tell you the interesting history of this ship and the important work she does a little later on. Our movie this week is the 1945 war epic, They Were Expendable, starring Robert Montgomery, John Wayne, and Donna Reed. Director John Ford was pulled off war duty by the government to make this tribute to America's PT boat crews. Ford had actually spent 5 days on a PT boat, getting to know the captain and crew he was about to profile in the movie. Their calm approach to duty in the face of extreme danger impressed Ford greatly and made him determined to tell their story with zeal. Now here's Act 1 of They Were Expendable. Red's Classic Theater is aboard the Artist Life, a Coast Guard auxiliary ship operating out of Steveston. And this 53-foot search and rescue vessel has an interesting past. She was built in Pearl Harbor by the U.S. Navy in 1944 and served as an admiral's barge for Admiral Chester Nimitz, attached first to the USS Saratoga and then later to the USS Midway. After many years in private ownership, the Artist Life was purchased by her current master, John Horton. John and his all-volunteer crew spend thousands of hours each year patrolling the Gulf of Georgia in aid of fishing vessels and pleasure boats in distress. Steveston is now the busiest fishing port in the country, with up to 1,800 boats setting nets at one time. That many boats in action means that sooner or later, the skills of the Artist Life will be needed. In fact, the ship has already attended 49 rescue incidents this year. We'll be back with more in just a moment. We're back aboard the Artist Life, where John Horton and his crew are members of the Canadian Marine Rescue Auxiliary. Now, some of the gear on board includes this rigid hull inflatable, donated by the Army, Navy, and Air Force Veterans Unit in Steveston. The Artist Life also carries a full complement of communications equipment, electronics, and charts, all the responsibility of the owners to buy and maintain. But their work is much appreciated. In 1991, John Horton and his rescue unit received the Royal Life-Saving Society of Canada Silver Medal for outstanding contributions in their area of duty. And now back to They Were Expendable. We're featuring They Were Expendable, starring Robert Montgomery and John Wayne this week on Red's Classic Theater. John Ford surprised everyone in Hollywood by casting Robert Montgomery in the lead role in tonight's movie. Montgomery wasn't an action type, but he was highly qualified for the part, having commanded a squadron of PT boats in the Solomon Islands. Ward Bond had been all set for a large part in the picture as a Navy Chief of Staff, but just before filming began, he was seriously hurt in a car accident. Director Ford wanted him in the picture, so he rewrote the role so that Bond's character would be injured in the film, allowing him to play the part on crutches. John Wayne was embarrassed that he was declared unfit for active duty. Unlike most of the crew, including the director, John Wayne had never seen any war action. At one point, director John Ford yelled at Wayne to salute in a way that at least looked as though he'd been in the service. Well, that was enough to drive the Duke from the set for 3 days, until Ford finally apologized. Now, They Were Expendable continues. Aboard the Artist Life, we've been given liberty by the Captain John Horton to look at our mailbag, brought to you by 24-Hour Video. Recent requests have come in from Valerie McCauley of Chilliwack, Ernest Mainwood of Matskwe, thank you, Sue Norris of Ferndale, Washington, and H. Klassen of Surrey. Our winner this week of a classic movie on video cassette is Ken Bradle of Sardis, and we're going to send you The African Queen. Now, if you'd like to send in your recommendation for a movie or a location, write to Red Robinson Television 12 in Vancouver. Coming up next week, the delightful 1948 classic, The Bishop's Wife, starring David Niven, Cary Grant, and Loretta Young. And 2 weeks from tonight, Merle Oberon and Laurence Olivier star in the 1938 film, The Divorce of Lady X. Right now, let's return to our presentation of They Were Expendable. Hope you're enjoying John Wayne and Robert Montgomery, and They Were Expendable on Red's Classic Theater. We're on board the Artist Life in Steveston Harbor. When he wasn't working in a scene, John Wayne dogged the footsteps of the director, John Ford. Wayne had his mind set on becoming a producer and a director, But he realized he knew absolutely nothing about the making of a motion picture. He watched John Ford carefully as he arranged the thousands of details for the production. The exterior scenes were filmed with a cast of 70 principal actors and 200 odd extras at the Coast Guard Naval Station in Miami, which doubled for Manila. Ford was a master of planning who knew where every explosion would take place and how every scene would fit into the final product. But he adapted to sudden changes brilliantly. When a brush fire broke out in the hills a few miles away, John Ford sent a camera crew to capture it on film to use it later in his own production. This know-how was not lost on John Wayne, who used it well when he directed his 1960 epic, The Alamo. Now let's return to John Wayne in They Were Expendable. Hope you're enjoying our presentation of They Were Expendable this week on Red's Classic Theater. Tonight's movie premiered in December of 1945, well after World War II had ended. The studio worried that its war epic may not be accepted by the public. Well, they shouldn't have worried. The critics loved it, and the public lined up around the block to see it. However, there was some unpleasant fallout from the movie, too. Commander Kelly, on whom John Wayne's part was modeled, called the portrayal a grotesque libel, and he sued MGM. He was awarded $3,000 by a federal court. And then former Lieutenant Beulah Greenwald found Donna Reed's depiction of her offensive and asked the studio for $400,000 to soothe her nerves. Well, after some dickering, she settled for $290,000. Obviously, it soothed her nerves and provided Valium for her for years to come. Now let's return to They Were Expendable. From the Artist Life in Steveston, time for our weekly movie trivia quiz. Actor Robert Montgomery spent time behind the camera as a director. Our question is, can you name the first movie in which he served as a director? We'll be back with the answer in just a moment. Here's the answer to our trivia question, and a bit of a tricky question this week. Robert Montgomery's first job as a director was in tonight's movie. What had happened was John Ford became ill during the latter days of filming, and he asked Robert Montgomery to step in and finish the job. Now let's return to They Were Expendable. Well, that concludes this week's edition of Red's Classic Theater. Hope you enjoyed They Were Expendable, starring Robert Montgomery, John Wayne, and Donna Reed. Be sure to join us next week on Red's Classic Theater when we present David Niven, Cary Grant, and Loretta Young in The Bishop's Wife. In the meantime, if you have a suggestion of a motion picture or an idea for a location, drop me a note. It only takes a minute. Red Robinson, Television 12 in Vancouver. We'd like to thank John Horton, master of The Artist Life, for hosting our show this week, and a big thank you to all of the volunteers of search and rescue along the Pacific Coast for your good work now and over the years. Thank you so much. Join us next week on Red's Classic Theater for The Bishop's Wife. I'll see you tomorrow morning on 650 Sea Isle and next week on Red's Classic Theater. From the dock here in Steveston, thanks for being with us. Good night, everybody.